All right, what is up, folks? Welcome back to another episode of the Help Me Understand podcast. We are kicking off episode number 255 of Help Me Understand. As always, I'm your host, Coach J.K. McLeod. And on today's Tuesday fitness and nutrition focused episode, we are going to talk about why most diets fail, or at least my take on why most diets fail, and what potentially actually really works long term. Very often you will hear a statistic bouncing around the fitness atmosphere that's something along the lines of 85% of people who lose weight regain it within a year or two, or 85% of diets fail. And what I want to spend some time doing today is sharing with you 4 reasons that I think most diets fail, and also some statistics that will back that up. So, as always, though, before getting into today's episode, I first want to say thank you, as always, for choosing to press play on the Help Me Understand podcast. I know you have plenty of other content that you could be consuming right now, so I always want to take a moment to express gratitude and say thank you for choosing to press play on Help Me Understand. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into today's episode. So, again, common theme or common phrase that is used is 85% of diets fail. And when we really dig into that, when we say, well, what do you mean it failed? Overall, for the purposes of today's discussion, let's define failure of a diet as folks who lose weight and then regain it back within a year or two. And one of the studies that's used pretty commonly to back that up is from 2007. And in this particular study back in 2007, there was a review of about 31 long-term diet studies. And in that particular review, what they found is that most of the participants regained, this is again out of 31 different studies, they found that most participants regained that weight plus tax within anywhere from 1 to 5 years of the end date of that particular diet. So when you use if I were to take that 85% and use an example, let's think about 20 people. Okay, so let's say 20 people go on a diet and they each lose about 20 pounds. Statistically, only about 3 of those 20 people are going to maintain that long term. And again, that being anywhere from 1 to 5 years after that diet has ended. So my purpose in today's episode is to give you my perspective based on some statistics and also just real life experience in working with a lot of different people over the past decade at this point through a lot of different ebbs and flows. And I'm going to take those particular experiences along with some of the things that statistics show, and I've put together a list of 4 reasons why I think most diets tend to fail. And along the way, I'll share my perspective on some things that you can do to potentially prevent and or reduce the possibility of those things happening to you. So, all right, let's go with number 1. So, and these are in no particular order that I've gotten this put together. So number 1, reason number 1, why most diets tend to fail is that folks don't understand the concept of metabolic adaptation. And metabolic adaptation is what I'm going to call your body's defense system against completely breaking down. So from a scientific standpoint, when you cut your calories really drastically, your metabolism will slow down to conserve energy. And that's also through a process called adaptive thermogenesis. So let me take a minute and make a bit of a distinction here. So metabolic adaptation overall is more of a broad umbrella because it includes all of the different ways that your body adjusts energy use in response to diet, activity, and body size. Okay, so that's metabolic adaptation. When we're talking about adaptive thermogenesis, that's basically one piece of your body's response to the overall umbrella of metabolic adaptation. So adaptive thermogenesis is the specific reduction in how many calories your body burns at rest and during activity when your food intake drops. So really, to put it in the most simple terms, your body basically becomes more fuel efficient and it starts burning fewer calories for many of the same tasks. So an example that I will use is as your body begins to adapt to the fact that you are now giving it less fuel, so feeding it less food, then there are particular, even just everyday sorts of things where you may not necessarily notice that your body is slowing down to conserve energy, but it is. One example that comes to mind is if you're laying on the couch and you want to change the channel. And let's assume that it's 2000 and let me bring it way back in the time machine. It's 2001. Okay, because I don't think these existed back then. It's 2001 and you don't have a voice remote. You don't have Alexa, you don't have Hey Google, you don't have Siri, you don't have something that you can just say, hey Alexa. Might need to keep my voice down because we have an echo. So then I don't want it to do anything and turn anything on while I'm on the podcast. So let's say that you say, hey, whatever, change the channel because you no longer want to watch the channel that you're watching. Well, if you don't have that, that means you need to get up and go either change the channel or go get the remote control. Assume the remote is sitting in front of the TV. Normally, when you are well fed, you've got a decent amount of energy, you may have no problem just getting up off the couch, walking let's say it's 8 feet to the coffee table or to whatever you've got where you left the remote. I'm getting way too detailed with this, but long story short, you have no problem getting up to go get your remote or go change the channel on the TV. Well, let's say that you are in a deep deficit and energy is just not happening these days. You may just lay there and decide, I do not really feel like it's worth it for me to get up and go change this channel. Certain things, even like picking where you park. Maybe you're normally somebody who typically parks a bit further away from your office building or from going into a store because you like to try and get a few extra steps in. Well, when you're in a calorie deficit, and your body is adapting to conserve energy based on no longer getting the full amount of the fuel that it needs, because that's what's required in order to actually be in a calorie deficit. You got to basically intake less than you put out. Then you make those particular adjustments, and it's no longer as convenient to have to walk 100 yards to the front door. You may decide to park a little bit closer. So those are just a couple of examples that just kind of off the dome are little things that you may find are a bit different. And those are contributors to, again, what I believe is sometimes not understanding or not respecting the fact that metabolic adaptation is a real thing and really does happen. So you don't make changes to respect that. And there was actually a study that was done back in 2016 on some of the Biggest Loser participants. If anybody, I believe a lot of folks are going to be familiar with that particular show. And what they did in 2016 is they tracked contestants about 6 years after that particular show. And they found that their RMR, which is their resting metabolic rates, were an average of 500 calories per day lower than what was predicted, which basically meant that their bodies burned less energy even at rest. And this, I remember this being like a huge deal a few years ago with really a lot of villainization, if that's the word, of the whole Biggest Loser concept and a lot of the damage that was done. And even recently, within this past few months, I know Netflix has put out a documentary or a docu-movie, I think it would be called, because I think it was part entertainment, part documentary, about the Biggest Loser and some of the behind the scenes on there and some of the really just flat out like dangerous tactics that were being used there. So that's just to share with you again, just overall about 80% of your TDEE, which is your daily energy expenditure, can really adapt downward during long-term caloric restriction. So something to keep in mind is that as your metabolism slows, which is going to happen, and hunger hormones, for example, like ghrelin, go up, people start to experience these stronger cravings and less energy to move. So it's basically like you're taking a double hit there because your cravings are starting to go up, you're getting more hungry, and at that same time, you have less energy to really move. So at some point, something's got to give. So my take on this is really that the whole like eat less and move more messaging that typically dominates the dieting space really kind of ignores the fact that your body is built to fight back against prolonged restriction. So things like following a smart training program, understanding how to auto-regulate your intensity on your training days, and even most importantly, really prioritizing your recovery. For me, those are the keys here to really reduce the breakdown that's inevitably part of being in a caloric deficit. All right, so that was number one. Again, in no particular order. I'm not saying the most important thing. These are just in the order that I put them together. So again, number one, not understanding metabolic adaptation. All right, reason number two that I believe most diets fail is because people have this unrealistic restriction and they're way too strict for way too long and not respecting just the basic psychology of deprivation. So overall, the science pretty much says that overly strict diets, like ones like where you're cutting out entire food groups, or you decide that you're going just ridiculously low carb for many folks, that stuff will increase your mental strain and the urge to overeat once the diet itself is over. And there was actually a study back in 1985 that's very commonly referenced, which introduced this whole like restrained eating theory. And it showed that dieters under strict control are more likely to binge or overeat after any slip up from, again, extreme, restricted, controlled dieting for too long of a period of time. Now, you may say, well, how long is too long? And that's where the really individualized approach is super important when it comes to dieting. I also believe that individualization can be really important for understanding training volume too. P.S. There was also another study that was done back in 2019 where they compared rigid versus flexible dieting, and they actually found that the rigid restraint predicted weight regain, while the flexible restraint supported better long-term maintenance. So for those of you who tend to default to really restrictive diets, and a very common comment that folks will make to me as I'm talking to them about nutrition and just overall what they've done in the past is they will say things like, well, cutting carbs is what's worked for me before. And that's basically kind of the premise of this whole episode. It's like, well, if it worked for you before, then why are you here now? Because if your definition of it worked is that it got you a temporary result, then yes, boom, check the box, you're right. Now, if your definition of it worked is that you were able to maintain a good percentage of the results that you had, that could be a completely separate podcast episode to talk about like the realistic understanding of what maintenance looks like with your results. It doesn't mean that if you lost 50 pounds, you automatically never gain more than like 0.01 pounds again. That sort of a thing. That's a whole different podcast episode. But just overall, getting an understanding of what worked and what didn't work for you. If you believe that extreme restriction, going completely cutting all carbs out worked for you, then why would you be back where you are right now? So just overall, there's some statistics that are out there. I think there was a study back in 2017 or a report back in 2017 in the International Journal of Eating Disorders that I found that said around 40% of dieters report cheat meal patterns that turn into full-blown binges within 2 to 4 weeks of restriction. So I was even a little bit apprehensive to share some of this information because my intention here is not to solve these particular issues that may be going on. What I want to do is present some context around this whole phrase of, well, 85% of diets fail and things like that, and present my perspective because I do understand that treating eating disorders and things related to that is certainly out of my scope. What I am hoping to do is bring some light to and expose that being constantly on the hamster wheel could be related to continually going through these binge and restrict cycles and thinking that, okay, I just need to restrict and I'll be totally fine. This overall data and also my real world experience says that pretty much for the most part, if you go into an unrealistic restriction for a long period of time, at some point, it's like a boomerang. It's just going to come right back at some point. So my take on this is that when you start to label foods as like off limits, your brain basically files them under high value, and deprivation always tends to win from my perspective in the long game. So I think that strategies like flexible dieting and planned refeeds can be really, really helpful here. Now, this certainly isn't to say, hopefully it doesn't sound like I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth. This certainly isn't to say that going through periods of restriction or periods of restraint cannot be helpful. It's a matter of what's the intention with that, and what's your, for lack of a better way to put it, like what's your re-entry plan? Or is this something that you plan to eliminate forever? So that's something to consider. And this is definitely front of mind for me right now is within the Fitness Foundations community, I'm going to be launching a November challenge, like no something November. And a challenge is going to be to pick something that you believe in the area of eating, sleeping, or exercising is a habit that you either need to eliminate or you want to make effort towards eliminating or significantly reducing for the month of November, because it may not really be contributing to the progress that you want with how you eat, sleep, or exercise. But again, this is understanding, okay, what's the intention? And we're going to do some work. I'm actually going to be dropping some content in the group about that. I may drop it on the pod too. I'm not totally sure. But some understanding of how do you work through that? Like, so first, how do you decide what that thing is going to be? Why did you decide on what that thing is that you're going to reduce, and or look at how many days can you eliminate participating in that particular thing? And then also, what's the plan after that? Okay. All right. So let's get to the last two. Again, overall going through 4 reasons why diets fail. Reason number 3, there's a lack of behavioral and environmental change. Okay, so with this one, folks think that it's just all about the diet. Like if I just do the math, I'm good to go. Because diets usually will teach you calorie math, but they don't teach you how to rebuild your habits and just as important, the environments that are now going to support that new-ish, maybe, or more polished or more tightened up behavior that you currently have. So there was a study done back in 2015 that compared long-term outcomes across different diet types. And what they actually found was behavioral adherence and environment predicted successes far more than whether someone followed a diet like keto, low-fat, or Mediterranean. So at the end of the day, the type of diet that you choose isn't specifically just about the type of diet. It's also about the environment that you're going to be in and whether or not that environment is conducive to the diet that you've chosen. So that's an example that I can think of is I've worked with a few folks before who worked in a bakery. I think it was like bakery. So they made like cookies and cakes and all sorts of like just a sweet spot, pardon the pun, like intended, just like sweets for days. And one of the parts of their job, because they did the actual baking and selling and all that stuff, was tasting what they made. So they would taste it for outcome to make sure that it tasted okay. Of course, I think this is pretty much like a no-brainer. Like if you're going to be around that stuff, it's probably going to be stuff that you will consume at certain points in time. So for that particular individual, if somebody were to try and tell them, well, you need to go on a no sugar diet, a no sugar diet may work for some folks, or it may actually help that particular person temporarily. But at some point, their environment, which they are not willing to change and they didn't need to necessarily change based on other factors. So it's a bakery that they either owned or managed. I can't remember exactly what the details were, but they had like a big stake in that particular business. So it wasn't something where a no sugar diet was going to be realistic for that particular individual. Now, did it mean that 90% of their calories had to come from the stuff at the bakery? No. What it does mean, though, is just a reminder that I think that's a pretty simple example of how does your diet, how does your style of eating, how does your nutritional philosophy fit in with the things that you value and the stuff that's important to you. And that's something that I talk about all the time. Whether it's your training or your nutrition, how do those things fit into your lifestyle? Even if you are currently living a, let's say, unhealthy lifestyle and you're looking to become healthier and you're looking to change the type of lifestyle that you lead, I understand that. And also there are certain things that you value, there's people that you value, there's experiences that you value, all sorts of things. So something that I believe has to be considered is the type of environment that you are going to be in, where when you've when you've started to really start to instill these habits and the right people around you and things like that, what's going to be important? Because if you believe that having the right people around you also includes social events and things like that, then taking on something that means that you can't eat after 6 p.m., but it's really, really important to you, and I would fully support this. It's really important for you to have there's certain people around you, and those people typically get together after 6 p.m., then does something like fasting where you don't eat after 6 p.m. work for you. So those are just some examples. All right. So my just overall take on understanding that one of the reasons that diets fail is because there's not enough focus on changing behaviors and environments is that you cannot white knuckle your way through an unhealthy environment. It's just at some point something's got to give, and something is going to give every single time. All right. I'm going to leave that one because I definitely talk about habits quite a bit, and move on to number 4. Okay. So this is the last one, but certainly not least. Reason number 4 why most diets fail is because there is not enough of a focus on maintenance or any sort of a transition phase. So most diets tend to stop after the weight loss phase, but physiology and psychology both need some sort of structured maintenance or reverse dieting phase to actually stabilize the results that you have. So there was a study back in 2018 that examined behavioral strategies that helped weight loss maintainers and found those who practice maintenance skills. So for example, things like gradual calorie increases, tracking calories periodically, and having routine check-ins, so some accountability, those folks were twice as likely to sustain the results that they had. So again, doing things that I would even say this is something that can help you prior to going into an actual deficit. So if we're going to say, if we're, for the purpose of this conversation, going to define dieting as going into a deficit, which that's not the actual like only definition of it, but I'll just give you that for right now. If we're going to define dieting as going into a deficit, I think that it should be mandatory. I do believe it should be mandatory that you go through a period of maintenance prior to going into fat loss and a dieting phase, so that you're not trying to introduce new skills, because tracking calories is a skill. It's something that takes time. Proper training is a skill. It's something that takes time. Understanding how to really figure out, okay, what is the right amount of protein for me? How does my body react when I've had enough sleep? How does my body react when I haven't had enough sleep? What are my stressors? What are the things that I allow to overwhelm me and trigger me? And then I decide I'm going to go like face first into whatever sort of foods. Those are things that you're not set up for success if you're learning those things while you're dieting, like while you're in a caloric deficit. In a caloric deficit, I'm a strong believer that you shouldn't be learning something new about yourself in a calorie deficit. You should really be going to a different level with things that you already knew prior to that. So trying to figure out how much protein you need to lose weight, or excuse me, we'll just say how much protein you need in order to maintain your muscle while you lose weight is not something that you figure out while you're trying to lose weight. You figure that out while you are trying to overall maintain. Trying to figure out your fat loss calories is not something that you should first be focusing on in fat loss. You should first focus on, what does it take just for me to eat, sleep, breathe, and be the normal human that I plan to be for the majority of the year? Because again, this dieting piece, the caloric deficit piece, should be a very small percentage of your overall calendar year if we're really looking at it. So instead of continuing to rant on this, I'll just give you my closing take on this particular bullet point, is that losing weight, for most of the information that I have myself, both anecdotally and also based on most of the research, losing weight is really the easiest part. I didn't say it's easy, but it's the easiest part as compared to maintaining. Because maintaining it really means shifting from dieting to actually like living your life like a normal person. Okay. So let's go ahead and wrap up. So first, now I'd like to reframe that word diet. So a diet by definition is not specifically about is not specifically about like temporary restriction and deficits and things like that. Generally, a diet is how you eat and the way that you live, like how you handle your nutrition. That is a great place, I believe, to start with just reframing the word diet. So when somebody's like, oh, what sort of diet do you follow? What they're probably asking you is, how have you been losing weight? But what we can do, if you're Team JK here, what we can do is we can reframe that and we can answer it with, oh, you mean like just my general style of eating? Like, oh, okay. Well, I focus on pretty much trying to make sure that I have protein in every meal. I try to make sure that I'm always getting in about 3 to 4 servings of fruits and or vegetables throughout the day. I don't really anything off limits. I do, try to keep certain things moderate, that sort of thing. Like that's really, I think, a great place to start. And then really building around 3 specific, really what I believe are sustainable levers. So one, if you are considering going into a phase where you're going to be in a caloric deficit, or you've completed your dieting phase, your deficit phase, and you're now like, okay, I want to maintain my results, then yeah, periodically a moderate deficit that's just small enough to preserve your energy and lean muscle mass can be super helpful. So that's something you would want to work directly with a coach. Okay. So you would want to work directly with a coach. And if you are unsure about who's good, I won't say who's bad, but who's good, some recommendations and things like that, feel free to reach out to me. I do one-on-one training coaching. So I design training programs. And then from a nutrition and sleep standpoint, I focus on basic foundational habits. If you're looking for a one-on-one nutrition coach who specifically will get like in the nitty-gritty, down and dirty, prescribe the macros, or even if you don't go with a macro-focused approach, be there to coach you, hold your hand, really like walk you through every single step, reach out, because I have a handful of very, very trusted coaches that I would refer to you, a couple of them who I've worked with myself for that. So if you do need a recommendation, let me know. So again, moderate deficit certainly can be something that can be helpful to preserve your energy and lean mass. Also, number 2, strength training. Make sure that you're still always including strength training in your weekly regimen. That is going to protect your muscle and typically prevent that metabolic slowdown that can often occur with deep caloric deficits. And then certainly, last but certainly not least, we've got to talk about behaviors and habits. So your habits around how you eat, how you sleep, and how you exercise, you still want to make sure that you focus on those things and continue to cultivate an environment that supports the goals that you have. All right. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring this episode to a close. So if you have listened this long, I sincerely appreciate you. Thank you so much. If you do have comments, questions, concerns, feedback, anything like that, some suggestions for future episodes, whether they be fitness focused or otherwise, feel free to reach out to me. You can shoot me a DM on Instagram at Coach JK McLeod. That's MCLEOD. Or you can email me jk@jkmcleod.com. So with that, I'm going to bring this episode to a close. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Help Me Understand podcast. Take care, and I'll talk to you next time.